views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. We had heard separately from two different Bronx elected officials that they each wanted to come on the program to talk about NYCHA, the city's housing authority, commonly known, of course, as public housing. So although they are from different branches of government, we decided it would be worthwhile to bring them together on the program to see if we can try and wrap our arms around the lead paint problems, the obvious repair problems, the political issues in addressing and budgeting for improvements, and on and on. We know there are so many issues surrounding public housing. They're all on the table for us tonight, maybe some other things too. Both our guests have been enthusiastic participants in the dialogue on the program, and we certainly appreciate that. So we say very quickly, welcome back to Councilmember Ritchie Torres. Nice to have you. And also to State Senator Gustavo Rivera. Sir, nice to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
In doing the background and the research for the show, I did chat with the council member beforehand. The problems are just immense, and the council member said to me, you know, you get a scandal maybe a month or every 3 months with other issues. We get one practically every week. There are 400,000 NYCHA residents. I counted 17 projects in the Bronx. Is that accurate? Probably close to accurate.
17 projects?
17.
I think it's actually
No, there could be
more,
nearly 100.
No, I meant projects as opposed to buildings in the Bronx.
No, there could be nearly 100.
All right,
Yeah.
then I'll back off. Nonetheless,
Many
are
of them.
the problems solvable, or do we have this albatross around our necks that we can deal with, but we're never going to be able to solve it?
It could be that the sheer magnitude of the challenge exceeds our ability to solve it. You know, the latest needs assessment indicates that NYCHA has over $31 billion worth of capital needs. So in order to repair every system and every structure that requires repair or replacement, you would have to invest $31 billion. So you need funding not only from the city and the state, but primarily from the federal government. So the main driver of decay in public housing is federal disinvestment. Having said that, there has been a culture of deception and dysfunction at the New York City Housing Authority. Right? NYCHA's leadership has misled the public as well as elected officials about the actual number of heat and hot water outages, the true size of the maintenance backlog, the true state of compliance with federal and local law, and the true extent of lead poisoning in public housing. So lies piled upon lies at NYCHA, and now we find out that those lies are only the tip of the iceberg, because the latest chairperson said that we might be breaking more laws than we've admitted in the past.
If I remember correctly, when you were first elected and we came
Yeah.
on, and I think at that point you were the chair of the Public Housing Committee in the City Council.
I was young back then. but-
Well, we were a lot less gray maybe after covering public housing and investigations for the city. That the cost was at 15 or 16
It was
billion.
16.
$16 billion, and I remember having that conversation with you. Still seemed like a lot of money. You haven't been in elected office that long. I haven't counted the exact years, but what has happened in that time to literally double the estimated cost for making, and we're talking about repairing pipes and, you know, wet walls and goodness gracious, elevators and everything else?
Look, NYCHA's in a state of accelerating decline. It's a building is no different from the human body, right? Once, you know, most of the buildings are either approaching or at the age of 60, the point at which these buildings begin to break down. And so the conditions are not only getting worse, but are getting worse faster and faster. The budget gaps are getting wider and wider. And NYCHA is experiencing a death spiral. And the only hope for breaking the death spiral is reinvestment from the federal government.
Senator, many people look at the current mayor. He has been in disfavor with many people. I hear the whisperings. I mean, we know what's out there. Not necessarily the most popular mayor we've had. And so we do this show and talk about this show, people are going to say, de Blasio has messed it up. But these problems, this is not the first mayoralty that have had these problems. Can you give me some assessment along the way of how we got here, where not only everything is falling apart, or so much is falling apart, but we've got to a point where it's almost unsolvable, or it feels that way anyway?
I think Ritchie hit upon this. I mean, we're talking about, there has to be, when we're talking about public housing, particularly an agency that is this large, the number of buildings that we're talking about, the number of population that we're talking about, it is the largest public housing agency in the entire country. It is if it was by its own, standing alone as a city, it would be the 5th or the 6th largest city. You probably know this.
Yeah, one of the largest.
One of the
the
largest
size of
cities.
Boston.
It's the size of Boston.
Which
as
would
it
be
is.
600,000 people.
So exactly. So
I had
we're
quoted 400,000, all right.
Exactly. So the point is, so we have, there needs to be an investment at every level. And when you have an investment, that the most important one is the federal. And if you federal level, which over the years has actually not only disinvested in public housing in the state of New York, but has disinvested in public housing across the country, so much so that many cities no longer have public housing authorities. They have been torn down, they have been kind of pushed to the side. In the case of New York, we don't have that option. There is, it is one of those things that is certainly, I don't want to call it an albatross, because we have to solve it. The fact is that there are over 500,000 people, men, women, and children, who have lived, many of them throughout their entire lives in NYCHA. Many of them would not have an ability to live in this city if it wasn't for public housing.
Because of the cost.
Because of the cost.
Right.
We have, I mean, we just have to walk outside. Actually, it was just before here. I was down about 135th Street. I was doing an interview with some students. They have a little studio down there. And I was just walking 138th Street, and there's 3 big, huge, brand new buildings right across the street from a NYCHA development, right? And these places, none of them is going to be affordable to any of the people that live across the street, literally, in the public housing developments down 135th Street. And so the reality is that you have, over generations, you've had a disinvestment from the federal government. You've had a disinvestment or not a strong enough investment, either from the city or the state. And all of that, when you mix it along with mismanagement, we have the current situation. But the fact is, over 500,000 people, we are responsible to them. We have to fix it.
It's very easy to say, well, you know what, it's the New York City Housing Authority, so it's his fault, and you point to the council member. What role can the state play? Is it a matter of funding? I mean, we're going to talk about legislation that you've introduced a little bit later on. But what role can the state play? Can the state play a role? I mean, is there a funding role, or is there a legislation role? Talk to me about how you see your role and your body's role in this process.
I think there's a couple of things that we certainly can do. There needs to be more of a commitment for funding. There was a $500 million commitment from the governor. I think that's a great start, but it's just, a fraction of what's necessary if we said $31 billion in capital improvement needs. So we need to do more. That's number one. But legislatively, there's certainly a lot that we can do. It's the reason why I introduced the bill that I introduced called Dakotas Law.
You can start talking about it now, sure.
Let me mention it. I mean, first of all, it is driven by, Dakota is the name of a young girl who is the daughter of Tisha Jones. Tisha is the president of Bailey Houses. It's a public housing development in my district. And her daughter, sadly and tragically, was poisoned by lead. And there was all these sorts of obstacles that she had during the time, her mother, all these obstacles that she had when she was trying to take care of her daughter. So she came to us and she said, I don't want this to happen anywhere. So we need to make sure that we understand, when we're talking about lead poisoning, it is not just public housing. This exists in private domiciles as well.
Of course.
And so we have to make sure that this is what Tisha was trying to tell us. She said, we need to make sure that we put a legislative package together which addresses all of it. And so it is a comprehensive bill, just a couple of things that are important to understand. It actually lowers the threshold from 10 to 5 milligrams per deciliter. That just means the amount of
blood lead level,
the blood lead level, the amount of lead that is in the blood that would trigger an investigation. So it actually lowers it to a federal standard from 10 to 5. It makes it so that every child up to 18 is covered. It makes it so that every doctor is required to not only ask the parent, when the parent comes in with the child and is filling out an application, saying like, this is the name, this is the blood type, et cetera, have they been tested? Once those results come in, they have a hotline that they would go to the state. There's a comprehensive package. And ultimately what we're saying is, we want to make sure that we find it earlier, that we connect all the pieces that, sadly for Dakota, were not linked together. So her mother obviously has to deal with the issue of her daughter having developmental disabilities for the rest of her life.
Very quickly, if you go back to Albany, do you think it has a good chance of passing?
I
or is
do.
it-
Not
in
not
other
only
words, there's a bipartisan nature to
not only because we're going to be in the majority next year.
it.
Not only
we
because of
weren't
that.
going there today, but that's
Not only
fair.
because of that. Well, I have to mention it.
Of course.
Not only because we will be in the majority, but honestly, because it's a bipartisan issue. It's something that we're just saying, let's create a standard. Let's raise the standard by lowering the threshold, and let's make sure that we connect all the pieces in the state.
And then we really have to ask our chair of the Department of Investigations or the Division of Investigations about when you get legislation like that, but if they don't follow the rules
Yeah.
or they don't follow the procedures, I think the most recent thing, and the health department has had a pretty good record of respect in the city of New York. Allegedly, they dropped the ball this last time around
Yeah.
because they had the information but didn't share it with NYCHA that these were problematic spots. Where do we go from there? So here's legislation that might work, that might be useful, but now you're wrestling with a rogue agency, I guess.
Look, I agree. Look,
Or
a law is
agencies.
only as good as its enforcement, but the senator's legislation is a game changer, and it would establish the most rigorous standards of lead safety in the country. I want to address a question that you asked earlier about the mayor. I mean, it's true that the culture of deception and dysfunction pre-exists the mayor, but the truth is it's a cancer that metastasized under his leadership. So when I held a hearing on lead safety in December of 2017, the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, Herminio Palacio, testified that there were only 19 cases of lead poisoning in public housing.
Which sounds, even
What-
on its
giving-
face, sounds like it couldn't be
But given
true.
the impression that the problem was non-existent, we have since come to discover that the actual number is 820. Why? Because the city's definition of lead poisoning was different from that of the federal government. For the city, the threshold for public intervention was a blood lead level of 10 milligrams per deciliter. For the federal government, the number should be 5. So there was a whole universe of children who had what the federal government would consider dangerously high levels of lead exposure, but for whom there was no intervention from the city. So the de Blasio administration did mislead the public about the full extent of lead exposure and lead poisoning in public housing, and that's something for which he should take responsibility.
The mayor is ready to spend $1 billion. Well, I think it was $1.2 billion. He signed an MOU saying he's
No, more 2.2 billion.
2.2.
Yeah.
All right, it's been reported differently. That's a help. How do you view that? And I guess the question is, you got the money. Will it be applied properly? And then the next question is, do they have enough workers to do the work? I mean, there's a whole train of things that go along with that.
So it's true that NYCHA is receiving more funding than we've seen in decades, right? You have the $3 billion in FEMA funding, the $2.2 billion under the consent decree, which you just referenced. You have $1.3 billion for roofing. You have $550 million from the state. You have $300 million for heating systems. Having said that, there are two problems. One, in the grand scheme of a $31 billion capital need, even a few $1 billion is a drop in the bucket. The second problem.
Let me just interject before that. But if you can, fix some people's
Absolutely.
problems, then those people are not going to be.
It will have a substantial impact improving people's living conditions.
Somewhere.
If we're able to replace the worst roofs, the worst boilers, the worst electrical systems, but let's keep in mind that the sheer size of the capital need far exceeds even the historic multi-billion-dollar investments that we're making. That's the scale of the problem we face.
But I want to get back and have you
And I
both
just the
weigh in.
second piece. So this was
Yeah. I'm sorry. You're right. I interrupted you.
What good are these multi-billion-dollar investments if NYCHA lacks the capacity to spend them efficiently? And therein lies the problem. We have to create a process by which these dollars could be spent much more efficiently. We cannot wait 10 years for NYCHA to replace the worst roofs in public
as
housing.
I understand it, and I mentioned it briefly before,
Yeah.
one of the issues is literally just enough workers
One is
to do the
staffing,
work and
second,
train.
design build, which NYCHA needs. There's a whole host of reasons. But
I want to ask you each to weigh in on this, and everybody hears about it and reads about it, and we see that the mayor doesn't get along with the governor.
Yeah.
And, the mayor is happy to say it's the governor's fault, the governor is defunded, underfunded. What are your thoughts on this, and how serious is this problem between them in solving or addressing NYCHA's problems? And you're next to respond to that.
look, is the public good well served by the psychodrama between the mayor and the governor? No. But, I have a simple rule. Whoever appoints the chair owns the agency. And just like the mayor owns NYCHA by virtue of appointing the chair, the governor owns the MTA by virtue of appointing the MTA. So my concern is not whether the two of them get along, but whether the governor and the mayor are managing public institutions responsibly
supposed to.
under their jurisdiction, and both of them are failing. The governor's failing with respect to the MTA, the mayor's failing with respect to NYCHA.
Senator, your thoughts on that same issue between them? And again, I guess you say, well, it's his fault. It's not my fault. It's their problem.
I think that what we need to do is focus on the right things. We need to focus on the correct things. It is unfortunate and real that the interaction between these two folks sometimes catches people in the middle. The folks who get caught in the middle are some of the folks who I represent, some of the folks that Ritchie represents, who should have, if both instances, both governments were working a little bit better together, they would be addressed better, the concerns of these folks. What I try to do is that I think that Ritchie's rule is not a bad one. We have to focus, we have to look at particular agencies, figure out who is ultimately responsible for them and hold that person or that institution accountable, and the person who appoints their chair, their chairperson is accountable. I think that's an appropriate rule, but ultimately, we just have to ask ourselves, and who ultimately do we serve? Right? Do we serve our own interests, or do we serve the interests of the community, and how best do we do that?
I want to address a couple of specific issues. Today was the day they started a ban on smoking. There's no doubt that if fewer people smoke, then they'll be healthier, and certainly you won't have secondhand smoke. Are you but others say, you know what?
Ban on smoking where?
In
Public housing.
In
public housing.
Yes,
Public
I'm
housing.
sorry. A ban on smoking
Yes.
in public housing.
Yes.
Do you see that as progress, or do you see that as kind of, you know what? Why do these people have to, give up their right in their own apartments to be able to do that? I mean, we all would know it's not healthy, but don't they have the right to do it?
I would seek similar things in public and private housing as well, private domiciles. I think
As a matter of legislation?
As a matter of legislation, potentially,
Wow.
yes. And when you're talking about a public health issue, if you are doing something that only harms yourself, God bless you. Do it. Listen, I have a drink now and then, so God, and I used to be a smoker. I'm also an asthmatic, so that doesn't make me very smart. But but if you're going to do something that harms yourself, that's good. But if you're doing something,
We'd rather
that
you didn't, but
right.
okay.
But ultimately, it's your choice if you want to do that. But when you're doing something like, for example, smoking in front of your kids, the secondhand smoke that's going to impact the kids, I think that there is an interest to have a conversation about where the standards should be as far as the public health impacts of actions of an individual. And it's the reason why, for example, I have passed 3 bills at this point to ban smoking outside of certain places, outside of schools, entrances and exits, outside of after-school programs, entrances and exits, and now we're doing one for senior centers as well. The goal is you can't smoke inside already in any of these places, but yet you can go right to the door, and as people are coming in and out, many of them either young kids or people with health issues. So there is a point to have that conversation.
Councilmember, your thought, is this a way to begin to change culture, to make people aware of healthier things? On the other hand, that people do smoke if they're in their apartment? It's kind of a personal choice.
So I highly doubt that NYCHA has the capacity to enforce the smoking ban. Having said that,
I'm sorry for laughing. We have so many. Considering lead paint,
NYCHA can barely fix the faucet. So,
right.
But having said that, the illnesses that are most commonly associated with smoking, like lung cancer, are among the leading causes of death. And if we're able to leave a dent in those public health outcomes, then the public good is well served. So I do support it to that extent. But I want to be realistic about the limits of NYCHA's enforcement capacity.
Another issue that's come up, and maybe it's been suggested a way to raise money, and that is to privatize some of the space in public housing, the public spaces in the center of the projects, et cetera. Do you think that's a good way to go, or is it not right and not a good idea to take away public space?
Look, the reality is NYCHA needs every dollar that it can get, and it needs every dollar that it can get to be spent on core infrastructure. And even though NYCHA is receiving historic funding from both the city and the state in recent memory, it falls short of the need. So do I support NYCHA's right to lease out private land to generate revenue, for repairs and for improvements? I do. I think it's a tragic necessity. Would I support selling public housing land? No. But I think leasing it out so that NYCHA can generate revenue for repairs, I think given the emergency circumstances, NYCHA's justified.
Daily News had a couple of, and I can't even believe it as I was reading the stories because they came out this past week, that NYCHA employees forged tenant signatures.
Yes.
Again, it's like, don't you know we already have big problems? How do you assess this? Is there any way to get your arms around it? I mean, and then do you go blame either the current chairman or the previous chairman?
Well, the trouble is what you had at NYCHA was such a high stakes environment where workers had an incentive to fudge the numbers and forge tenant signatures in order to create the illusion of progress. And it's been well established for years that NYCHA has had a pattern of closing complaints without actually making the repairs. You know, NYCHA will go to your home, knock on your door, and the moment you're not home, they will close the complaint. So tenant not home, which is one of NYCHA's policies, has often been used as a pretext for avoiding actual repairs and creating the appearance that we've reduced the backlog more than we actually have.
I think there was a story that said people have waited 100 days if the walls are crumbling, and I would think that's a minimum.
Residents in public housing are known to wait years for skilled trades like plastering or painting. The conditions are abominable.
Senator, beforehand we were talking about how you were more in support of the previous chair than Councilmember Torres was. What are your thoughts on the leadership in NYCHA at this point? Stan Brezhnev is now the chair. What are your thoughts?
I think, first of all, let me state it for the record, and I think my entire career in public service has been based around the concept of accountability. So I believe 100% in accountability, and if there were inappropriate or illegal acts committed by anyone, then they should be held accountable. And the folks who are responsible for those, I mean, the same way if there was someone, God forbid, who was working for me and did something on my watch that was inappropriate or illegal, ultimately I'm the one that's responsible. So there should be, accountability is absolutely important and essential. I would say that from my interactions and my knowledge about the people who are currently running the agency, they know what they're doing. They seem to have a clear vision about the difficulties ahead. And I'm going to keep a close eye on how they're doing the things that they're doing and what they're doing and how they're doing it. And in the same way, I will hold them accountable. At this point, they seem to be, again, very knowledgeable about what needs to be done, very realistic about what needs to be done, and are trying to do the best that they can with the resources that they have.
Every elected official's office receives complaints, especially now about housing, and undoubtedly you hear
Without a doubt.
Maybe you'll get it more so with NYCHA because it's a city run.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
So, how do you respond when, I mean, I saw, what was the number I saw? Something like 170,000 open violations or open complaints right now or concerns. How do you respond when somebody calls your office and says, Senator, my bathroom walls are falling down? I mean, do I have to list all the issues?
But it happens all the time, and there's different things that we do. There's been instances, for example, in which NYCHA has not provided heat and hot water to senior buildings in my district, and we've actually but not only knocked on everybody's door, but helped them bring legal action, get them legal representation, bring the media. There's other instances in which there have been other parts of my district that have had similar issues, and we brought it to them. We brought the media to them. I think it's we've tried to intercede on behalf of tenants when they have an issue that needs to be replaced.
To the degree you can, I mean.
Exactly. I mean, ultimately, anybody that walks in through my office door, we will try to do what we can to be helpful to them. And if it is a NYCHA resident, then we will assess what we can do to be of assistance, and we will nudge when we need to nudge. We will bring attention when we need to bring attention. We'll get them legal assistance when they need it. We'll get them media assistance when they need it. So we try to assess
Or
what
you'll
is
just
needed.
raise $31 billion and solve the problem.
Hold on. No, these are not Bloomberg
Councilmember,
pants.
before, we could go around and round about public housing, but I do want to give you an opportunity.
Yeah.
You were part of 2 street namings very recently. I was aware that they were both sad stories. I'm hoping that soon we're going to name a street after somebody who's alive and well. Obviously, Minnesota's Familiar was quite a hero. Just if you want to talk about the 2 street namings, I think that's fair.
Well, one was Minnesota's Familia,
Who was a police officer.
Yeah, she was killed a year ago. She was a member of the 46th precinct. So I had the opportunity to rename a street right outside the 46th precinct in honor of Minnesota's. And she was one of only 3 or 4 women in the history of the police department who was killed in the line of duty. So she's a historic figure. And I consider patrolling the challenging streets of the Bronx and risking your life to be one of the highest forms of public service. So it's a street renaming in which I take deep pride. The second one, we're announcing that we're going to rename 183rd and Bathgate after Junior Guzman, who was the victim of the most senseless and savage act of gang violence that our city has seen in recent memory. And for me, the legacy that Junior leaves behind, summed up in the hashtag Justice for Junior, has been an awakening for all of us. Right? It's been a national rallying cry
About gangs.
against gang violence, against youth violence. And there's a sense in which Junior Guzman, the image of his death, is in our time what the images of Emmett Till were in his time. Right? It has awakened us to the sheer horror of gang violence in our neighborhood, and I think we are more committed than ever before to confronting the crisis at its core.
If we had an hour show, that would be the second half of the show. We'll bring you both back and talk about gang violence. Gentlemen, thank you so much, Senator Gustavo Rivera, Councilmember Ritchie Torres. Love having you here. It's so vitally important to talk about our most important issues with our elected officials. Thank you so much. Folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show, anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org. You can send us a tweet at BronxTalk, or you post them on our Facebook page, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. If you would like to reach them, I will be happy to move the questions along and make sure you get a response. Also, of course, you check out our archives at BronxNet.org. You find Bronx Talk by following the watch menu on the new BronxNet website. We thank our producer, who's Helen Greenberg. Our director is Nicholas Marrero. And we thank the senator and the council member. We'll see you next week. Good night.